Hello, everybody. Gary Edelman, American Battlefield Trust, and we wish we were out here with you. We are at Yorktown, Virginia. If we'd have been having a conference right about now, we'd be interacting, we'd be showing you all sorts of cool stuff. But we're going to try to do this with you virtually as best we can. It might be a poor replacement, but this is what we can do for now. And don't worry, we will be together before too long. So we hope you enjoy these video series as we go around. And today we're going to be having a little bit of a Rev War bent here, and I think you know the deal. There's a whole lot of fighting in the north in the Rev War, and then there's a whole lot of important fighting in the south, and it's going to all devolve in the end, at least simply put, back down to this place at Yorktown, Virginia. And to unpack this and make some stops and talk all about this, let's bring on our Senior Education Manager, Dan Davis. Take it away.
Thank you, Gary. Hey, everyone. The road to Yorktown began several hundred miles to the southwest at Guilford Courthouse on March 15th, 1781, where Major General Nathaniel Greene's Continental Army will engage and inflict a high number of casualties on Lord Charles Cornwallis's British Army. Cornwallis's future deputy, Charles O'Hara, will write that that Cornwallis lost roughly around half or just over half of his men during that battle. It forces Cornwallis to withdraw toward the coast to resupply and refit his men in North Carolina. And then he makes a very critical decision. Rather than continuing to engage Nathaniel Greene, he decides that he's going to march north into Virginia. He believes that Virginia is supplying Greene's army. He wants to cut off that supply line, and he's going to subjugate and take over control of Virginia. When Cornwallis reaches Virginia in May of 1781, he's going to engage in a spring and summer campaign with a continental force under the Marquis de Lafayette. They are going to play a cat and mouse game across Virginia, moving into central Virginia. Cornwallis even comes within a breadth of capturing Governor Thomas Jefferson at his home at Monticello in Charlottesville. But eventually Cornwallis is going to have to resupply his army once again. He's going to move back toward the Virginia coast, the Virginia Capes. And in July of 1781, he receives an order from his direct superior in New York, Sir Henry Clinton, to establish a deep water naval base in Virginia. And Cornwallis is going to pick Yorktown. He's going to pick Yorktown for a couple of very key reasons. Number one, the ground that you see off and beyond, in the distance beyond my left shoulder, my right shoulder, is cut by creeks and ravines. It can be heavily fortified. A defender can take advantage of that rough terrain. The other reason why Cornwallis decides he's going to come to Yorktown is that just across the York River is Gloucester Point, and Gloucester Point commands traffic. If the British can put guns there, they will command traffic on the York River. All the while, the Marquis de Lafayette is keeping quite a close eye on Cornwallis and his movements, and he writes to George Washington, who's still in New York with the main Continental force, that Cornwallis is moving on Yorktown, and there may be an opportunity here to strike a fatal blow to the British. Washington, meanwhile, has his sights set on New York. He'd been pushed out of New York earlier in the war in 1776, and he has tunnel vision. He wants to retake New York City. He wants to defeat Henry Clinton in a decisive battle in New York. And for this, he's planning a major operation with the French allies. Comte de Rochambeau, the army commander, Comte de Grasse, the naval commander. He is hoping, Washington is, to have de Grasse sail from the Caribbean, from the West Indies, up to New York and cut off New York Harbor. De Grasse doesn't want to do this. He knows he's got to get out of the Caribbean sometime in the middle of the summer into the early fall because he wants to withstand the hurricane season. He doesn't want to get caught in a major storm and have the French fleet founder. But he doesn't want to go to New York. The sandbars in New York Harbor are of a great concern to de Grasse, and so he decides, and he tells Rochambeau that he's going to move to the Chesapeake and try to cut off Cornwallis in the Chesapeake here at Yorktown. When Washington receives word of this movement, he makes a very critical decision. He is incredibly decisive. He makes the most decisive takes the most decisive action of the war. It's a true, great testament to his leadership. He decides to abandon his efforts to capture New York, and within roughly about 48 to 72 hours of hearing that de Grasse is sailing for the Chesapeake, he has the French and American armies marching south toward Virginia to rendezvous with Lafayette and to cooperate with de Grasse in a major operation against Cornwallis. On August 30th, de Grasse is going to arrive at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, and he's going to cut off the Chesapeake Bay to any naval British reinforcements for Cornwallis. Several days later, he's going to engage a British fleet under Sir Thomas Graves. Graves is going to be defeated by de Grasse and which will completely cut Cornwallis off to the outside world. Meanwhile, Washington is bringing all of his heavy artillery, his heavy siege guns down from Newport, Rhode Island, and his armies are on the march southward from New York through New Jersey to Pennsylvania, Maryland, and finally to Virginia. Washington is going to arrive in Williamsburg about 16 miles up the road to the camera's right on September the 14th. And a few days later, his troops are going to begin arriving, and they're going to begin disembarking and rendezvousing at Williamsburg. On September the 28th, Washington and Rochambeau are going to leave Williamsburg, and they're going to completely cut Cornwallis off from any land support here at Yorktown. Cornwallis, on the afternoon of September the 28th, has no escape, very little hope for reinforcement, and the final campaign of the American Revolution is going to begin. Hey everyone, just over my left shoulder is the Grand French Battery here at Yorktown. This was the largest artillery complex constructed by the French Army during the siege here in October of 1781. It actually consisted of 5 separate batteries, not only on my side of the Hampton Road, but on the opposite side of the Hampton Road, just off in the distance. These batteries were connected by communication trenches. Approximately 30 guns were set up here, ranging from mortars to 16 to 24-pound guns. Now, on September the 28th, George Washington, the Allied Army, the French Army under Comte de Rochambeau are going to move out toward Yorktown from Williamsburg, and through the course of the next day and a half, completely surround and cut off Lord Charles Cornwallis's army on the land side. The French are going to take up a position on the left or toward the northwest. The Americans are going to take up a position off to the right, to the southeast. And for the next several days, time is spent with the soldiers moving through here in their fatigue parties, chopping down trees, preparing to start building the parallels or the earthworks to finally commence siege operations. Soldiers would be going through these woods on either side of the camera, collecting branches and sticks to form fascines, which are small bundles of sticks to place into earthwork or trenches, ditches, to allow soldiers to move up if you're in an attacking column. They're also constructing gabions, large woven baskets of dirt and rocks and wood to place to reinforce the earthworks. They have a lot of time to do this activity because Washington's siege guns have yet to arrive. They're being brought from Newport, Rhode Island by a French force under the Comte de Grasse. They're being unloaded about 6 miles to my right on Treble's Landing near Jamestown on the James River. And over the course of the next several days, the Allies are up here working. Those guns are being unloaded and slowly transported the 6 miles up here to the siege lines. All the while, Washington and Rochambeau are reconnoitering or scouting the British position. And along with those scouting missions, the engineers are going out onto the open plain off to the camera's right, between where I'm standing and the British position, to mark out where the first trench or parallel will be staked out. They're staking them out with pine branches that they've cut down from the trees here in this area. And on the evening of October the 6th, skirmishers are going to be deployed out into the open plain to my left, the camera's right, and the work parties are going to make their way up to those pine branches, and they're going to start digging. It's raining, it's dark, and out of the darkness on the American side of the line, George Washington is going to ride up, dismount, grab a pickaxe, and join his men in the work in digging the lines. Washington just doesn't want to say that he assisted in constructing the trenches here at Yorktown. This is a symbolic gesture. Washington has been with these men since the spring and summer of 1775 when the war began. He has not taken a leave of absence, unlike many of his subordinates. He's been with them at Trenton and Princeton when the Revolution was faltering. He's been with them at Brandywine with the loss of Philadelphia. He stayed with them at Valley Forge in the brutal winter at Morristown. And now he is here with them again in a symbolic gesture, saying that he is with them, he supports them, and they're going to begin digging their way to the final victory. It's going to take roughly about 3 days for the Allies to complete their trenches. What's interesting is that on the morning of October the 7th, in a grand ceremony, the Allies are finally going to march into their earthworks, much to the surprise and chagrin of Cornwallis. The British are going to open fire as the Allies occupy those earthworks. And then Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, a battalion commander, a former member of Washington's military family, former staff officer, is going to order his battalion of Connecticut and New York companies to stand up on top of the earthworks that they had dug the night before. And he's going to put them through the manual of arms in clear, plain sight and in complete defiance of the British guns and the British behind their earthworks at Yorktown. On the afternoon of October the 9th, roughly about 3 o'clock, the first Allied gun is going to open fire. We know it's a French gun. It's going to be fired from somewhere in this area, although the French batteries will not actually open here in the Grand French Battery until October the 10th. But on the afternoon of October the 9th, sometime around 5 o'clock, Washington himself in the Grand American Battery located behind the camera closer to the York River, the first Grand American Battery, is going to fire an 18-pounder. It's going to be the first shot fired into the British works from the American lines. It's going to be fired by George Washington. The Allies are going to open up a near constant bombardment of the British position and completely pound away at Cornwallis. They're slowly inching their way to victory. Hey everyone, I'm standing next to Redoubt 9, a reconstructed Redoubt 9, one of the most famous locations on the Yorktown battlefield. Redoubts 9 and 10. Redoubt 10 is located, again, reconstructed just on the opposite side or over the cameraman's left shoulder. Now, both of these redoubts were reconstructed in the 1930s when the Civilian Conservation Corps came to do work here at Yorktown. Archaeology was also done on the redoubts, so we have a pretty good idea of how large they were and what they look like. Redoubt 9 in particular was pentagonal shaped, probably had 2 howitzers in it, and was manned by about 120 to 125 men under Lieutenant Colonel Duncan McPherson of the 71st Regiment. You may recognize that regiment. They are Fraser's Highlanders, a very critical component of Lord Charles Cornwallis's army. Altogether, elements from the 33rd, the 43rd, the 80th, the 71st, the Von Bows, and the Prince Hereditaire regiments manned Redoubts 9 and 10. Redoubts 9 and 10 were very critical to Cornwallis's defense. They commanded the southeastern portion of his defenses, where his defenses were the weakest, and overlooked the ravines along Wormley Creek, which is in the far distance behind me. But these redoubts are also going to become critical as the siege goes along. After the American bombardment opens in the first week of October, the Americans recognize, the French recognize, that to get closer to Cornwallis's lines, they have to take these 2 fortifications. They begin construction on a second parallel, roughly about 700 yards or so, 400, 700 yards from the British lines. And they realize that they cannot extend that parallel, that trench line, all the way to the York River over to my right, the camera's left, until these 2 redoubts fall. So on the afternoon of October the 14th of 1781, the French and American officers are going to meet and begin making plans to capture the redoubt. The French are going to draw the task of attacking Redoubt 9. The French attack is going to consist of roughly about 400 soldiers from the regiments Gatineau and Dupont, and they're going to be led by Count Guillaume Dupont. The American attack is a little bit more interesting for several reasons. Light infantry from 3 different American battalions, men from New Hampshire, New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut are going to attack Redoubt 10. One of the more interesting aspects that I just mentioned of this attack is that some of those men from Rhode Island are from the old 1st Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Regiment. They're African Americans fighting in an integrated Continental Army. The Marquis de Lafayette is going to have command of that assault, and he's going to delegate the task of leading the attack to Major Jean de Jumay. De Jumay had actually accompanied Lafayette when he came to America to fight for American independence back in 1777. But Lafayette's going to be overruled by his commander, George Washington, because Alexander Hamilton, a good friend of Lafayette's, a former staff officer of Washington's military family, is going to go to Washington and plead with Washington to give him the opportunity to lead the assault. Hamilton is the officer of the day, and he's a bit of a glory hound. He wants the opportunity to prove himself in battle. Washington's going to overrule Lafayette, and Hamilton is going to be given the task of attacking Redoubt 10. A little after dark, several signal guns farther on down the line to my left from a French battery are going to open fire, and that's the signal for the assault to get underway. Dupont is going to lead his men forward. Officers are going to be at the rear of the column with orders to kill any man who runs away from his post. Orders are sent throughout the French column to maintain strict silence. As they quietly approach the Redoubt 9, a British soldier, actually a Hessian, is going to call out 3 times, "Who's there?" in German. When no answer is given, the Redoubt is going to erupt in artillery and musketry, and Dupont is going to lead his men forward. He's going to get his men into the ditch that you see behind me. Sappers, miners, carpenters are going to start chopping away at the phrases that you see reconstructed behind me. Dupont is going to get his men up through the ditch into the Redoubt, and only when they're in the Redoubt is Dupont's going to give the order to open fire. And that's going to be a very destructive volley crashing into the ranks of the British and the Hessian troops. There's going to be a period of very, very brutal, horrific hand-to-hand combat, and the Redoubt is going to fall to the French forces roughly within about 30 minutes of the attack going off. About the same time, those 400 men under Alexander Hamilton are going to advance over the open plain to my right. When they're not going to encounter any British sentry. Their sappers and miners are going to start destroying the abattis, the obstructions out in front of the Redoubt. And when they do, the British see them, they're going to open fire, and Hamilton's going to lose control of his men, so to speak. The Americans are going to rush forward, pour into the ditch of Redoubt 10, up and over the Redoubt. One of the first men to enter the Redoubt is Lieutenant John Mansfield from the 4th Connecticut. John Lorenz, another member of Washington's military family, now a battalion commander, is going to lead about 80 men around to the rear of Redoubt 10 in an attempt to cut off the British retreat. Redoubt 10 is going to fall in roughly about 10 minutes after, again, a brief period of hand-to-hand combat. They're going to capture the Americans are going to capture the British commander there, Major James Campbell of the 71st Regiment, and the Readouts are going to fall to the Americans and to the French on the night of October the 14th. This is incredibly important, not only because now the Americans can complete their second siege line and continue to batter away at Cornwallis's works, but with these Readouts in hand, they can place guns to fire point blank into the weakest part of the British position. Hey everyone, I'm standing next to the Augustine Moore House, or the Moore House, just southeast of Yorktown. At the time of the American Revolution, this was roughly about a 400 to 500 acre plantation owned by Augustine Moore. When the armies arrived, the British Army, the French, the American armies arrive in the fall and summer of 1781. It is believed that Augustine actually left this house and took his family, one of the few families that actually evacuated the Yorktown area, and took his family to Richmond. Now, following the fall of Redoubts 9 and 10 on the night of October the 14th, 1781, prospects look incredibly grim for Charles Cornwallis and the British Army. With those redoubts in hand, the Allies complete their second parallel. Now they can fire point blank into the British position at Yorktown. On the evening of October the 16th, Cornwallis is going to make an attempt to evacuate his lines around Yorktown and move over to join the garrison at Gloucester Point. The first few boats make it across the river, but then just as it is today, a storm comes up, Mother Nature intervenes, boats are sank, they're blown off course, and Cornwallis is forced to return to his works in Yorktown. On the morning of October the 17th, sometime around 10 a.m. from the best accounts that we have, a lone British drummer, followed by a British officer waving a white handkerchief, emerged from the earthworks. October the 17th is a very important day, not only here at Yorktown, but it marks the 4-year anniversary of John Burgoyne's surrender of the British Army at Saratoga. 4 years to the day, another British commander is going to seek terms for surrender. Cornwallis sends over a message to George Washington, and he asks Washington for a cessation of hostilities so that the terms of surrender can be agreed upon. Washington, remember, is a very shrewd politician. He's a very shrewd commander. And he decides that he's not going to suspend his bombardment until Cornwallis actually sends the terms over to him and an actual negotiation can begin. The two commanders go back and forth and exchange messages through the course of the day. And it is finally decided that emissaries from both armies will meet here at Augustine Moore's house to discuss the terms of surrender. On the British side, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Dundas of the 80th Regiment, as well as Major Alexander Ross of Cornwallis' staff, are going to meet with Lieutenant Colonel John Lorenz, a battalion commander in the American Army, and representing the French, Count de Nuaz, Lafayette's brother-in-law. Lorenz is appointed, I think, simply because he can speak French and serve as an interpreter between the British officers and de Nuaz. There are two critical aspects of these discussions. Number one, Lorenz, Washington, and the Allies are adamant that the British Army will not be paroled and sent back to England. They will remain in North America as prisoners of war. The second is that Washington will not allow the British the honors of war when they surrender the garrison. This is in payback, retribution, for Sir Henry Clinton's terms that were given to Benjamin Lincoln the previous spring when Benjamin Lincoln surrendered the Charleston garrison. The British will be forced to march out of their entrenchments with their colors cased, and rather than playing an American or French air, they will be forced to play a tune of an English tune. The terms are finalized. Cornwallis will sign them for the British, along with Captain Thomas Simons of the British Navy. They'll be sent through the lines and signed by Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse. This takes place early on the morning of October the 19th, and later that afternoon, the surrender ceremony, the official surrender of the British Army, will take place here at Yorktown. Now, for an event that takes place a number of decades later after Cornwallis' surrender, I'd like to bring in our chief historian, Gary Adelman.
Thanks, Dan. It's 40 and about a half a year later, almost to the day, that war will find Yorktown again. I think you know the story. There's going to be another video about this. You can learn a little bit more, but suffice to say that I think the largest army in the world under George McClellan is trying to move up the peninsula at this point, the Virginia Peninsula. The Southerners have flooded the Warwick River. They're going to make it very difficult for the Union to move on, so there's siege operations here again. What I find interesting around here is that there was a Union battery. You've seen the pictures of it with big mortars over there. I think it's battery number 4 off the top of my head, not far from this position over here at what is now a military base. There's also a battery 1, some huge Parrott rifles off in that direction at Farrenhold's house. They also took some forward posts. They were going to put some observation posts in the trees, using rickety ladder systems to get up there and whatnot, but they really wanted a good forward position, so some of them started using the Moore house. And if I am correct, I believe that they were using the roof of the Moore house for a time, and even General McClellan himself is said to have come forward, I'm going from memory here, and is sort of crawling up the roof to get a good look at the Confederate positions over there. Of course, this is McClellan's whole game. He's going to do a huge sort of a siege operations, and you know the story. 4 or 5 weeks, he prepares to get it ready. He's going to open up the Confederates can't possibly hold, but on May 4th, 1862, the Confederates are found to be gone. That will result, of course, in a chasing action that will result in the Battle of Williamsburg, and then, of course, the Battle of Seven Pines, and it moves on to the 7 days, but that's for another time. Now, we're going to go to another spot, and we'll resume with the excellent story that Dan Davis was telling.
Hey everyone, I'm standing in Surrender Field here at Yorktown. In October of 1781, the Allies, commanded by George Washington, consisting of his own American army, and the French army under Comte de Rochambeau, defeated a British army commanded by Lord Charles Cornwallis. On the afternoon of October 19th, at the appointed hour in the terms of surrender given from Washington to Cornwallis, the British garrison here at Yorktown emerged from their defenses and marched solemnly down the Hampton Road off to my left, the camera's right. Under the terms of the capitulation, the British marched out without the honors of war. Their colors were cased, and they were going to only be allowed to play a tune of a British origin. Typically, they would march out, a defeated army, a vanquished army would march out with their banners in the breeze and playing a tune to honor their foes. This was not to be. Washington's terms were harsh, In retribution for the terms given to his then second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, the previous spring, when Lincoln was forced to surrender the American garrison at Charleston, South Carolina, to Sir Henry Clinton. As the British marched out, they played a tune. Nobody really could agree on what the tune was, but it has come down to us through the pages of history as the world turned upside down. Waiting for them on either side of the Hampton Road was the French army under Rochambeau and Washington and the American army. The French stood on the left, the Americans on the right. Lord Charles Cornwallis, however, was not at the head of the column. Cornwallis had remained behind, claiming that he was sick, probably staying in his headquarters or somewhere in the vicinity of the Nelson House in Yorktown. As O'Hara approached the French and American ranks, he would not even acknowledge Washington. Comte de Rochambeau noticed this and sent one of his aides, Count de Dumas, to greet O'Hara. O'Hara rode over to Rochambeau, who was not the Allied commander. It was Washington. And Rochambeau motioned to the other side of the road for O'Hara to go to Washington. I cannot imagine what Washington was feeling at this moment. He'd been slighted not only by O'Hara's actions, but by Cornwallis's actions. Cornwallis had sent his deputy, his second in command, to surrender his army. Washington must have been seething. He was a man who had a volatile temper that he tried his entire life to control. And so he decided that he was not going to accept the surrender of O'Hara. Just as Cornwallis had sent his second in command to surrender the army, Washington directed O'Hara to his second in command, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, to accept Cornwallis's sword. O'Hara went to Lincoln. The two men met. O'Hara extended his sword. Lincoln took it ceremoniously, handed it back to O'Hara, and joined O'Hara at the head of the column as the British continued to march down the Hampton Road. When they reached this area standing behind me, a part of the road trace, which you can see with the fence on either side, just over my left shoulder, they turned into this field. And awaiting them in the field was a circular formation of French cavalry. And into this field, the British army marched, grounded their arms, left all of their equipment and their accoutrements. When the British regimental commanders with their colors cased approached the American sergeants, or several American sergeants, to surrender their colors, the British officers were aghast. They would not give their colors over to a soldier of a lesser rank. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, a battalion commander and a former member of Washington's military family, intervened and pulled an ensign aside to collect the British colors. The procession continued through the course of the day and into the afternoon and evening hours before the British finally returned to their defenses at Yorktown. Almost immediately, Washington would send his aide, Tench Tillman, riding northward to bring word of this surrender to the Continental Congress. It will take several weeks, in fact, just a little over a month, for the word of Cornwallis' surrender to reach London. It would send shockwaves throughout the British city. Lord North and the Secretary of State for the American Colonies, George Germain, would receive the word that the Second British Army had surrendered in North America in 4 years. In December, a speech is going to be made before Parliament by Lord North, asking Parliament to suspend all offensive operations in their former colonies. Yorktown would lead to the toppling of the British government. George Germain would resign later in 1782, followed as well by Lord North. It would take another year for emissaries from France, the United States, and Britain to hammer out, agree upon, and ratify the Treaty of Paris of 1783. And that treaty would effectively grant the United States its independence. Now I'd like to bring on our chief historian, Gary Edelman, for one final word. Gary?
Thanks, Dan. We know a lot of you. We see you. We hear from you, from the membership, and you sometimes tell us, oh, thank you for this video. And we hope you enjoyed this virtual experience here at Yorktown. And sometimes you'll say, oh, my God, you stood out in the rain and gave that tour. You know what we have to say to you about this is thank you. Okay, as our leaders, Jim Lighthizer, David Duncan, often say, we have the best members in the world. You are paying us to be out on battlefields right now. shooting video and educating the public about the things that we love. You are helping us preserve hallowed ground, and in that way, helping to perpetuate our democracy, something is so sorely needed right now today. So we just want to say this for Chris White behind the camera, maybe he'll do a little nod for us there, and Dan Davis for all the presentations, and Chris Mikowski and Bobby Crick. We've even got Melissa Sadler with us here today. Thank you for everything you do that allow us to do our work, to do our important work. Without you, none of it could happen. We hope you enjoy this video and the others.